Welcome to Clive Barker's Undying, a spooky game that I am covering out a season. If you ask me, Halloween is whenever you want it to be, even if it's July, April, or November 1st. Maybe each month could have its own Halloween. That aside, Undying is a 2001 horror first-person shooter with light RPG elements running on an original Unreal Engine. It was written by Clive Barker, which is vaguely hinted at by the title, Clive Barker's Undying. One egotist. This is one of the definitive guns and magic games, which means you can dual-wield flaming skull powers and a revolver, together at last. Undying is an action-packed haunted house of a game, an above-average haunted house, but absolutely a carny haunted house. It has all the scripted scares a growing YouTuber needs and all the Scooby-Doo monsters you could want in a Halloween game. Seriously, bats, skeletons, demon werewolves, pirates, ghosts? Cavemen? This game may as well be about a gun wizard massacring a Party City Halloween costume party. I say this game is more horror adjacent rather than actual horror, though it does have some tense parts early on. To be blunt, I don't find this game to actually be scary. I tend to find a lot of horror more funny than actually scary, so I typically prefer this amusement park ride feel to horror. If you can't be scary, you can at least be amusing. That's Undying for me, and boy is it a fun ride that deserves a bit more mainstream attention. Let's dive right in, starting with the technical side of things. This game is easy to acquire since it's sold on GOG. It's cheap, $6 by default, $1.50 on sale. Runs without any major tweaks on Windows 10. It just has one big issue: resolution. Alright, so I usually try to be on the ball with the technical side of things in these videos. I try to get the game's patched, properly configure my settings, find an English translation, etc. But this is one game I have to make an exception for, and it's not necessarily because nobody's ever made a patch for it. See, Undying only supports 4:3 aspect ratios out of the box. It's still completely playable on my 16:9 monitor, it's just stretched to fit the screen. Now, there is supposedly a 16:9 aspect ratio patch out there, as listed on the PC Gaming Wiki. Unfortunately, this touches on an intense distrust of mine. Strange, overwhelming, undocumented community patches that rely on a bunch of .dll files and hacky renderers. Doesn't help that it set all my antivirus software off. Maybe it was a false positive, but since the game is just stretched a bit without it, I opted out. This stretchiness ultimately doesn't really bother me, though I should clarify I have the worst eyesight in my entire family. My footage is still in 4:3, so let's say this video is edited to be especially nostalgic. In short, if you're fine with stretchiness, Undying runs straight out of the gate. Undying is a fairly complex story for a circa 2000 shooter, which shouldn't be too shocking given that they marketed it using its lead writer, Stephen King. Story isn't my strong suit, so I'll give you a rough summary. You play as Patrick Galloway, an Irishman and a World War I veteran. He had his life saved from a baldromancer by a man named Jeremiah Covenant. As amazing as that name is, it's a dead giveaway he's got some kind of ancient Mayan Baphomet curse on him. Little fun fact, the bald guy was going to be a protagonist, but Clive Barker purportedly asked for a man he could sleep with. What could he have meant by that? In 1923, Jeremiah calls upon Patrick to return the favor. He reveals that long before the events of the game, the Covenant family performed a ritual on an island with a bunch of standing stones. Now they all have a curse that induces madness and death, the big two, and not in any particular order. Jeremiah, now ill and confined to his mansion, needs Patrick's help ending the curse in addition to protection from his undead siblings. Jeremiah's got 4 siblings and feuds with all of them. I'm not sure if I can relate to that or not since I'm an only child by retroactive systematic elimination, whatever I mean by that. In his adventure to stop the curse, Patrick must face off against the 4 undead Covenant siblings who have become various shapes and sizes of ghosts, magicians, warlords, and, I don't know, werewolf larpers. He must also confront an old nemesis of his, Count Otto Kaisinger, who is just a douchey magician who got Patrick exiled from Ireland before the events of the game. Look at him, surged tanky and really let himself go. From here on out, the plot mostly revolves around discovering the nature of the curse and eliminating the Covenant family using the one weapon that is capable of killing them: a scythe. Massive bonus points for it not being a sword because I'm really sick of legendary swords in media. Undying has a more complex story than average for a shooter and a decent helping of backstory and lore. However, the story is largely optional. I mean, most of the cutscenes are still unskippable, and it's a good idea to at least check on the journal entries and listen to dialogue. Yes, you have a journal, and there's a lot of optional backstory and details to glean from it. Still, you don't need to pay too much attention to the main story or background lore. Objectives tend to be pretty straightforward, and even if they aren't outright mentioned to you, it shouldn't take long to intuit or stumble upon them. I'll talk more about the story later in the spoilers section. Let's talk about visuals. A large chunk of this game is about exploring the Covenant Mansion, and it might be one of my favorite mansions in any first-person shooter. Not much competition, but hey, it's something. It's sprawling, gaudy, and ominous. You're often in danger, though there's plenty of calm moments to take it in. The general aesthetic feels like it changes from wing to wing, even between rooms. Rich people with their freakish artwork, secret bookshelves, random mirrors, haunted built-in churches, Japanese-inspired Hey! You're gonna spill blood all over the tiger carpet! It's like a moderately saner Winchester mystery mansion. There's a maze-like feeling to it after all. Don't be too deceived, as it's actually fairly linear and the game does a surprisingly good job with its invisible guiding hand most of the time. It can be a bit corridoric at times, but I still quite adore it. If a game that's about 40% haunted house attraction mansion is all you want in life, just go play this game right now. There's considerably more to this game than just the catacombs. You go to Caveman Land or Monastery, Red Zen, way too many catacombs, and more. The catacombs are probably my least favorite part of the game because of how bland and drawn out they are. Completely contrasting that is an alternative dimensions you visit, which are almost always colorful and distinct. Sprinkle in a couple levels that have you exploring the English countryside too. It might not look like much today, but this is ambitious for an Unreal 1 game. It's certainly a bit grassy, though. A lot of the environments have this hint of surreality that I'm fond of. Undying is definitely at the tail end of the period where 3D graphics had that subconscious unnatural feeling to them. Your mind still needs to fill in some blanks here and there. Following from that, the technical visuals, particularly in terms of texture and model quality, are a little bit behind the curve. I mean, look at this old man's face. Enough crust for a pizza 10 feet in diameter. Some of the corridors are staggeringly bland, and a decent chunk of this game is poorly lit, which can mean it's either ugly or too dark. You ask me, Undying isn't as good with lighting as a lot of its contemporaries were. To its credit, it still has its moments, especially in the mansion. It also compensates with good art direction, which especially shines throughout the mansion and in the aforementioned alternative dimensions. I also quite like the designs of most of the enemies, even if a lot of them are Halloween-flavored cannon fodder. They may not be overly original, but it's clear that a lot of love went into their designs. Particle effects are above average for the time, too. And it has little details in the right places. Every mirror in the game is fully functional, for instance. Can someone tell me why modern games struggle so badly with reflections in comparison to older titles like Undying and Prey? Another little detail that impressed me is that you trail blood around whenever you walk over a pool of blood. Pointless, but it's a little thing that you usually don't see in games. I also give props for the ambition of the rain and snow effects, even if they are kinda janky. One last place where this game didn't age too gracefully is its cutscenes. Some are fairly well animated and realized, at least for the time. They're stiff, but it's a respectable effort for an in-engine 2001 Unreal Engine cutscene. Others are super bland, barely animated conversations between Patrick and nameless staff at the mansion. Strangely, some cutscenes are in first person, whereas others are entirely in third person. Why? Animations simply vary greatly in quality. I mean, look at Patrick's walking backwards animation. How does this happen? Did they forget to properly animate it? I do like the inclusion of the Mortal Kombat fatalities enemies can perform on the player though. I only saw a couple of them, but as far as I know, every enemy and boss has a unique fatality. They're fairly well animated too, so that's funny. Also, I didn't find this out until I was goofing around after beating the game, but this game has way too many crosshair options. My personal favorite is the deer crosshair. I didn't try it, but I assume it's really good in the deer boss fight. While I'm on the topic, I should mention that the crosshair feels tiny in general. Could be a resolution issue though, I don't know. The HUD is a little awkward in this game. Not too bad, but the text is rather small and you have a weird amount of real estate wasted on this prompt that tells you what your latest journal entry was. Not even if you have a new one, just what kind of journal entry it is. Like, it tells you if you got it from a cutscene or a conversation or a journal entry you found laying on the ground. It's kinda weird. You also have this game's awful inventory, but I'll get to that. I'm just gonna get sound design out of the way early since I never have too much to say. It's above average for sure. Enemies have distinct callouts and feedback, your weapons and spells sound fairly decent, nothing overly stock, and the ambience is good. Those are the big three for me. Undying does a great job with audio cues in general, especially with enemies and magic. You can always locate where the teleporting Cthulhus are gonna show up, you hear a whisper whenever you use scry, every material has a unique footstep sound, etc. Just a lot of little bits of good sound design. Mixing can be slightly off sometimes, especially with explosions. It's fairly consistent otherwise. Voice acting is generally good as well. All of the named characters deliver decent performances, and it also features John St. John of Duke Nukem fame. Personally, I can't really separate his voice from Duke Nukem. Clive Barker also does some lines of code. The actors for unnamed characters aren't as good, though they're mostly passable. I couldn't help but notice how comically bad the voice acting for generic pirates is, though. It's pretty hilarious. And the music, well, when it is present, it's your standard symphonic soundtrack. Pretty early to the punch in this regard, actually, though no less forgettable. I'm just the wrong kind of person for symphonic soundtracks. They're so oversaturated and risk-adverse to me. There is one memorable track, and it's this 10-second long stinger that the game reuses repeatedly. I think it plays 4 or 5 times throughout the game, which might not sound like much, but it's still way too many times. While it is bad, it does add to the cheap haunted house feel, so let's call it a net 0. Oh, and I need to address a sound design hiccup that I can't say I've seen before. Music in this game comes from the world itself. In most games it's omnipresent, to best put it. Here you can clearly tell where the music is coming from, even though it makes no sense for it to have an origin of sorts. Just listen for a moment. I put it off for long enough, so it's time to finally get into the gameplay. Undying plays a lot like other shooters from its era. Fixed health, wide variety of enemies, an arsenal you carry in its entirety, and a good sprinkling of secrets to find. Undying does stand out for its addition of fairly bare-bones RPG mechanics, mostly relating to its magic system. You can get maximum mana upgrades, mana regen upgrades, and usable items that permanently increase the power of a single spell on use. Nothing to improve your health, interestingly. These upgrades can be found scattered about the game world, often in secrets or side passages. They make a big difference, so they serve as a good encouragement to explore the maps. You can become pretty powerful in this game, as I'll discuss in these upcoming sections. Movement in Undying is respectable. You don't move too fast nor too slow, though some areas are fairly expansive relative to your movement speed. You move fast enough to evade most attacks and keep your distance from enemies, so I'm mostly okay with it. Plus, you have a spell that boosts movement speed by a lot, so that helps. What's a bit more strange is jumping. In combat, jumping is a fairly reliable means to dodge attacks. Mastering misdirection and strafe hopping is a key part of fighting melee enemies in this game, and it's quite fun once you have it down. In fact, projectile enemies aim where you're moving, so that's another dance that you have to master. But bizarrely, outside of combat, your jump feels incredibly puny. Undying is a game that wants you to do platforming with this uber flaccid jump, and the weird borderline ice physics near ledges doesn't really help. I don't know a better way to describe it. It's almost ice physics, but not quite. It's jank. Patrick can single-handedly take on armies of skeletons, but 2-foot heights? Not his wheelhouse. You do get to fly at some points later in the game, complementing the terrible jump. Flying is just as, if not more, clunky, and I'm unsure the best way to describe it. Like, you can only move the direction you're looking in when you're in the air, so it's almost unusable outside of platforming. Like, good luck aiming. If it makes you feel any better, only a mere 100th of this game is spent platforming, and probably even less is spent flying in combat. Health is fixed and can only be healed using portable medkits, which take a moment to kick in. This adds tension to the combat and punishes you for making too many mistakes consecutively. I find it's a comfortable system. These medkits are scarce in the early game, though you can easily have over 100 spare later on, so the game is on the generous side. Medkits tie into this game's honestly kind of awful inventory system, though. To describe it neatly, it's primitive and clunky. It's an ugly real-time list where you need to hit far apart hotkeys to select and use items. Really feels like you're doing that movie hacker thing whenever you go through your inventory. Doesn't help they need to almost squint to read my inventory because the text is so tiny despite all the empty space in the menu. Even by 2001 standards, this inventory was ridiculously archaic. Personally, I suggest keeping the health kit equipped at just about all times, since navigating the inventory is almost impossible in combat. The other reasons you'd use it are to see what keys you have or to use an amplifier to upgrade a spell. Exceedingly rarely, you'll need to use dynamite to blow something up or an ether trap to expose Aaron Covenant as Old Man Jenkins or whoever it is in today's episode of Scooby-Doo. That's about it. Undying is notable for its surreal difficulty curve, borderline a genre curve. In the early game, it feels like a survival horror game, exploring a haunted mansion with scarce resources, facing off against swarms of tough enemies can be tense at times. You do get an inaccurate fire hose spray spunk spell, but a lot of survival horror games have a weak infinite ammo weapon, so it doesn't change much. But then you get the Tibetan war cannon, a potent infinite ammo slug-puking shotgun that freezes enemies. That marks the start of an upwards power curve. A couple hours later, you get the shield spell, and that's the exact moment where you gulp down your spinach, become freakishly muscular, and use your signature scythe to slash Hellspawn back to the nether realm. It's definitely rather weird. I wouldn't say Undying is especially hard or easy, it's pretty middle of the road in terms of difficulty, and I think it stays relatively constant throughout. Still, I've never seen this kind of shift in a game before, where it goes from borderline survival horror to badass scythe magery. Resources eventually became fairly abundant, which is something Patrick probably isn't used to, being Irish. The early game kept me on my toes. The late game, I had no qualms about gobbling down health kits and charging into fights. Speaking of segues, the shooting generally does feel satisfying on average, but it can vary. Weapons are fairly accurate and consistent, with select few exceptions, and I feel like most misses were on me. Most. This game has that awful Doom 3 style flinching on damage, which can really throw off your aim when you're in deep Kuso. I personally always hate exaggerated damage flinch, though I don't get hit too often in this game, so it's manageable I guess. Also tying into the variable feeling of the shooting is the fact that your arsenal and spells run a big gamut in terms of quality. What's great is great, what's bad is bad. Undying has a small, strange selection of weapons. Like I said, the quality of your weapons varies a lot in this game. I will talk about magic in the next chapter, but I should specifically address that this game is an early adopter of Bioshock 2 style dual wielding, where you have a weapon in one hand and a spell in the other. You have to get used to utilizing both of them in combat, maybe even juggling weapons or spells when necessary. I love this style of combat, and I wish more games implemented it. Also, Patrick is left-handed, which is cool since us lefties are severely oppressed. I mean, have you ever thought twice about those school desks? Probably not, you righty-ler. Beyond being progressive, Undying is also a pioneer with its weapon and spell wheels. It's definitely among the first-person shooters to feature this. I think it is outright the first. I couldn't find much information on this topic on the internet, so let me know if I'm wrong. Anyways, they're functional, if a bit clumsy and hard to use in the heat of battle. I find a way to distribute your weapons and spells to be a bit odd since they don't seem to have a particular order. Weapon icons are clear, but spell icons are rather abstract. Short of having them memorized, trying to switch between weapons or spells in a pinch only puts you in a bigger pinch. You need to get used to the motion of selecting your favorites. No time dilation either, so you absolutely have to do it on the fly or between fights. Okay, onto actual weapons. The best, most fun weapon you have is a Scythe of the Celts, which is a crazy powerful melee weapon with ridiculous range and a wide swinging arc. It hits everything in front of you and dishes out damage just as chunky as dismemberment. It's the only weapon capable of dismembering enemies, so they put a lot of work into this thing, combined with a haste spell for all-around speed and a protective barrier spell, and you're almost unstoppable with this thing out. It only has two downsides. Your mana regen is slowed while you have it out, and it's hard to get used to your melee weapon technically being in the 6th weapon slot. Yeah, that's a thing. Neither are that big of a deal. You could probably main this thing all the way to the final boss. Easily one of the best melee weapons in shooter history. To scratch off the other weird close-range weapon, you have the Tibetan War Cannon, a hard-hitting early-game weapon that drops off when you get the Scythe. It's an ice projectile flamethrower-ish thing. You'll be super reliant on it early on, so you have to get used to its short-range, projectile arc, and charge up. All the things you'd expect in a dragon gun from Tibet. Also, it slows enemies down, making them easy to finish off. Cool weapon. Oh, I didn't intend that pun. It just takes some getting used to. You got a standard revolver and a sawed-off shotgun as your sole firearms, as in they're the only proper guns. They're generally what you'd expect, though the shotgun is honestly kinda garbage due to its awful damage output. Feels like one of those shotguns where it always spreads out in a Looney Tunes outline of your enemy too. Probably the worst shotgun on my channel up to this point. It always sucks when a first-person shooter has a bad shotgun. Both firearms can be a bit awkward to use thanks to a jank triple whammy. They have the least hit feedback of any weapons, hitboxes in this game are noticeably wonky, and worst of all, they seem to shoot out tiny invisible projectiles that move slower than you'd expect. These don't make the weapons unusable. I'd say the revolver stays viable thanks to its decent all-around stats, though it'll definitely push you towards using magic and other weapons. You do have alternative ammo types for the guns. They aren't worth too much discussion. Revolver gets silver bullets that do more damage yet reload slower because silver was heavier in 1923, and the shotgun is phosphorus shells that shoot out a fiery blast, now with even more of a blind spot in the middle of the screen. Bad shotgun gets a naughty corner. Infamously, there's the spear gun. There's about half the game between acquiring the 6th weapon and this thing, inexplicably. Most people think the spear gun is abysmal, but it conceals a powerful obtuse secret. If you cast a lightning spell while you have it out, it will charge the currently loaded spear. If you're in an area exposed to the sky, instant kill lightning will strike whatever the spear hits. I can't blame people for hating a weapon so reliant on such an obscure mechanic. I kind of like it, even though you can otherwise annihilate a caveman's entire brain stem with it, and it'll take 2 more spears to finish off. Turns out Neanderthals didn't have brains, just as paleoanthropologists always suspected. I think I'm just biased in favor of spear and harpoon guns, frankly. There's also the Molotovs and Phoenix eggs. Molotovs are exactly what you'd expect. Bouncy, and mostly used by monks. At least they one-shotted everything I was able to hit with them. Phoenix eggs are the final weapon you find, so surely they're the BFG, right? Nope, they're just Molotovs that you can control in the air, leaving Patrick vulnerable in the meantime. The controls are slightly awkward because it feels like the camera's above and ahead of the projectile itself. I mean, it could be worse, but it has almost no practical combat use. Why is this the final weapon? And lastly, to circle back around, your first weapon is a Gelzabar's Stone. Yeah, it's the best take I'll get. On its own, it seems unremarkable. In fact, its sole attack simply unleashes a small shockwave that knocks enemies back. Where it really shines is when you use it in conjunction with magic. Each spell has a level, with higher levels increasing power and sometimes adding new effects. Spells typically max out at level 5, but holding the stone out temporarily increases their level by 1, potentially up to 6. This makes a huge difference in some cases and opens the door for pure magery. It's secretly pretty powerful. And again, speaking of segues, magic! So this game does have a rather hit or miss weapon roster. That's why magic is so important. Magic isn't an alternative to standard weapons, instead being used alongside your weapons. Though I should be honest with you, while every spell does have a use, only some of them stay viable for an extended period of time. So it's a bit of the same issue here as well. As I've mentioned, you acquire new spells throughout the story. Each spell has 5 levels upgraded using the amplifier item, and you can get a temporary 6th level by equipping the unpronounceably named green rock. There are a limited number of amplifiers, though you don't need to be too conservative with them. Upgrading your spells is important, so remember to put your points out when appropriate. Whenever you find a new magical tome, the power goes to Patrick's crotch, assumedly because mana regeneration is a metaphor for his refractory period. I stole that joke, apologies in advance. Appropriately, the second spell you get is Ectoplasm, and it looks like that. Probably the worst spell in a game since it's as damaging and accurate as it would be in real life. If you aren't point blank, you'll miss the broadside of a barn. Similarly, you start with Scry, sometimes known as Barker Vision, which just makes spooky stuff happen sometimes. Not spooky enough? Bam! Instant horror. So scary! The game does some fun stuff with it though, so I'll give it that. Undying is Vanta Black level dark at times, and Scry is one of the only ways to light places up, so it stays decent for that. Also, I like how Patrick always throws an American Sign Language symbol for Clive Barker when you use it. Cute touch. Let's just talk about the good spells for a moment before returning to the less good spells, like a reverse stool sandwich. Here's a shield spell which projects a barrier in front of you that absorbs damage. You'll see me using it a lot since it's the only defensive ability in the game. Enemies hit hard later on, so it's important for the late game. It's cheap to cast and quite potent, though the game does counteract it with certain enemy types, so it's not an instant win button. Similar to that is haste, which boosts the speed of movement, attacks, and mana regen. All 3 of these things pair with a scythe like a fine wine. The mana regeneration is especially ridiculous since you nearly instantly regenerate the mana from casting the spell back. I love haste since Speedy Gonzales Grim Reaper is the way Clive Barker intended you to play this game. I wish they didn't have visual overlays though, they're a bit distracting. That's the only real downside to them. In short, use haste to lay waste, use shield to unleash a field of pain. Plus, your Ectoplasm spell is stomped to the curb by the Exploding Skull spell. Yeah, Exploding Skulls. It's fun, campy dollar store Halloween stuff. You can spam it or hold the button down long enough to skeletize in real life to unleash an Ultra Skull Frick. Charging it up is a tad quirky as you need to be in combat for it to fully charge. It's generally better to just spam it, though I can't say that a fully charged Flaming Skull Explosion isn't both satisfying and deafeningly loud.
I can take it.
It might be your most reliable late game source of damage aside from the scythe. In this random book you find sitting in an ancient chapel, you learn the art of necromancy. That's the second best thing you could find in the wild, next to a big rusty metal pencil-like cylinder buried under the ground in Germany. I like how the resurrection animation is almost certainly a glitch that they chose to leave in a game. I respect that, literally implementing a glitch as a feature. Todd Howard would be proud. With this, you can sort of be a necromancer. It's not that practical since your resurrected allies suffer from brain rot, probably relating to their brains rotting. Also, it instantly kills skeletons and pirates when you use it on them. Why? Well, the lore reason is that pirates have skeletons and... I've got nothing. Go ask Clive Barker. Similar to that is this spell, which instantly kills the Clotuhus. You also need it to delete a couple magical barriers here and there. That's about it. To me, it's kinda weird to have spells where their primary purpose is that they're capable of instantly killing under certain conditions. The lightning spell is another example, as it's almost useless unless combined with a spear gun in an outdoor area, which is even more specific. I appreciate them trying to make certain spells more useful at certain parts of the game, but why put limited upgrade points into something if it's only good against a specific enemy type in a specific set of levels? So in short, this game does have a wide and varied arsenal of spells and weapons. Some are niche and won't see much use, others are amazing and extremely enjoyable to use. The fact that you can use both at once gives the combat a unique flow few other shooters have. Gotta reload your revolver? Blast them with your load. Scythe not deadly enough for ya? Cast haste and show him what Sonic the Hedgehog would be like if he had the strength and speed of some Irish guy. Even if a lot of it falls off, nothing is truly worthless, and it's at least fun to experiment throughout the game. I would personally make some tweaks to the balancing, but as is, everything that is great is really great, and I really won't ever get sick of the Scythe. Moving to level design, I need to talk about the mansion once more. It's not as freeform as I may have made it out to be. It's still relatively linear with occasional optional areas, and there's no point where the entire thing is open to you. Despite making multiple trips to it at different points in the game, it's not as Metroidvania-esque as you'd expect. I think they intended it to be a Metroidvania at some point in time. I suspect this because you usually get spells or items right before you're required to use them under correlating elements. Things like the barriers broken by Dispel or the door charged by the lightning spell. These only occur once or twice before never appearing again. Even in spite of that, I still got lost a good few times, so maybe it's better off that it's linear anyways. There's a decent signposting, but the game absolutely tests you to see if you're paying attention with the keys you find and rooms you pass by, so watch out. Speaking of, Undying is weird about a very specific thing. Doors. It's also weird that this is the fourth time on my channel I felt the need to specifically talk about doors. This time, instead of being over-designed, wrecked, or lethal, they're simply really odd. See, most doors in this game are locked. I'd say for every 10 doors you see, maybe 8 or 9 of them are locked. Patrick always comments on whether the door is outright impassable or if it needs a key. I appreciate that, that's good game design. But what is it with this game and having an absurd number of doors you can't go in? And you can't tell if a door will open or not until you actually press up against it. Undying does not have an interact key, and instead uses the Quake 1 method of needing to shoot or touch things to interact with them. Again, this is weirdly archaic for a game released in 2001, the same year as the likes of Halo and Return to Castle Wolfenstein. This has consequences with doors, since if a door conceals a load zone, it's very easy to accidentally cross between levels. This happened to me a lot, and it doesn't help that this game has untelegraphed points of no return from time to time. It's a level design pet peeve of mine for it to be unclear which path is for explorers and which path progresses the story, with there being penalties for being unlucky in choosing the main story path. The abundance of load screens compounds this. Maps in this game are weirdly small, despite the bulk of them not feeling like they push too hard graphically. Anyone know why this is the case? As for the more general level design, it's fairly linear. Undying is a game where the level design is not too stand out in general. A lot of the fights in the early game take place in corridors, and the level design actually gets more varied later on. Very unusual, since it's usually the other way around. The combat in the mansion is held up by an ambush factor where enemies suddenly appear and you need to think and act quickly. This is used to good effect, which is proof that corridors aren't inherently bad first-person shooter level design, it's just about how you use them. Undying at least tends to make smart uses of its corridors, though they can outstay their welcome sometimes. Occasional areas are a bit too open for their own good. You have a precision weapon from the get-go in the form of the revolver, but I establish is a bit janky. Long-range encounters in this game aren't great because of how close range the bulk of your arsenal is. After all, this sniper-esque spear gun doesn't show up until roughly the final hour of the game. A lot of levels have overly wide open arenas with not too much to see in them. A lot of the level design is rather flat, and it's not until later on that you start seeing more uses of verticality. Don't expect to be able to flank enemies or take cover in the vast majority of this game. The level design seemingly wants you to be aggressive or aggressed, I guess. It has its appeal, it's just not particularly complex or variable. In other cases, you have outright massive levels like the monastery and the countryside. While I respect their ambition, they were designed to waste your time. The Key Hunt Monastery is a Minotaur's playground with awful signposts and unintuitive objectives. It's completely unclear where you need to go and what order you need to do things in, to the point where you may even want to consider drawing a map. Doesn't help that it's got a ton of archers, just to add to the monastery vibe. The first visit to the countryside is honestly kind of a level design atrocity, and it's easier described than the problems with a monastery. I really want to emphasize what's wrong here. Let's say you start at point A, and the opposite end of this massive map is point C. The halfway point is point B, marked by a small tower. You walk from A to C, but you can't actually enter the building at C yet. You need a key. So logically, there's a key nearby that only works on the tower at point B. Inside that building is another key. This key isn't used to open the door into the ruined building at point C. Instead, you head to the off-to-the-side bar near point C for a scripted event to knock the door over. Despite having no relevancy, this doesn't happen if you don't have the key from point B. You then platform from the farmhouse into the ruined building, where you then use the key to open a chest that gives you the key to a nearby cellar. It feels like a massive time waste, like there's no point to any of this. And it takes minutes to walk between each point, by the way. This truly is padding. Undying is at the absolute tail end of the key hunt era of shooters, and honestly, it's not something I miss all that much. Key hunting works best in an action-focused game where they're color-coded, like Doom. In a far more story-driven game like Undying, they just feel like padding and nothing more. Thankfully, the countryside and monastery are the worst example of this in a game, and nothing else comes remotely close to being this egregious. There's almost no key hunting whatsoever in the latter half, which is nice. So there isn't too much Undying's combat arena design. If it's not in a fairly open room, it's in a hallway of some kind. I do feel like Undying fundamentally plays well enough to forgive the somewhat slapdash arena design. The game does have fun with some of its encounters and gives you infrequent set-piece battles now and then, like the battle on top of a mage tower or this fight across a massive bridge. I just want to emphasize that it's nothing that will blow you away. There's not much I actively dislike, but there's also very little that truly leapt out at me. Undying is a good general gameplay flow, and it tries to mix things up, at least in minor ways, every 1 to 2 hours of gameplay. The slower segments can be a bit key hunty, though the game generally does a good job leading you to your objectives wordlessly, so I mostly forgive it. Mostly. In fact, to neatly tie back into the whole game goes from survival horror to action majory point I brought up much earlier, I think the level design complements that curve too. In the early game, a lot of arenas feel like they're designed so you can strafe backwards Series Sam style. There's a handful of fights that you have to take rather slowly too. Later on, I found myself pushing forward more consistently, being more aggressive. Thanks to things like pits, backward strafing becomes worse and worse of an idea as you progress. It does help that you get things like the shield spell, but the level design is a subtle way this game makes you feel like you've become powerful by the end. There's a genuine feeling of coming a long way since the beginning. Kinda reminds me of Morrowind, and I like that kind of progression arc. Undying has a decent sized roster of enemies. In a design choice I really like, each segment of the game has a unique set of enemies, making them all more distinct from each other. I'll only go over a handful of enemies so that you can at least experience some of them for yourself. Early on, you fight the Howlers, who are fun to fight thanks to their rhythmic feel. You're forced to be aggressive with these guys, baiting out attacks and sidestepping their charges. I really like them, so it's a shame they mostly vanish from the game about a third of the way through. You do fight a ton of them, but there was always a degree of finesse to fighting them that never got old. In the Catacombs, you're supplemented by the worst enemy in the game, the Skeletons. A lot of enemies aim projectiles where you're headed, and these skeletons huck dangerous rocks at the speed of skeletons who huck rocks quickly. They also don't die unless you use Invoke on them, so I hope you can pop a couple amplifiers on it. A lot of combat with them requires hiding around corners, slowly baiting them out and one-shotting them with Invoke. I hate them. They're minefields that grind the game to a halt. I like the Crowmen who get you drunk by shooting you with a projectile known as Crunk. Just ask Clive Barker, he'll confirm that name. You can use this spell to cure it, much like how you can do the same with alcoholism in real life. Mixed feelings about the teleporting tribals. They're unique and a hard counter to the somewhat overpowered shield spell. They force you into a much more punishing rhythm than any other enemy in the game. I find them annoying to fight because of how much invulnerability they have. Well, they're annoying until you realize you can cheese them. I'll just not tell you how. You can figure it out yourself. Ultimately, what makes me happy is this game is incredibly light on hit scanners and damage sponges. Nothing takes a stupid amount of punishment punishment and almost everything is dodgeable. The pirates do wield shotguns and pistols, but they've got a bit of wind up and won't shoot unless they're fairly close. This game has almost nothing wrong with this enemy design whatsoever, aside from some understandable minor annoyances and a couple enemies who are exponentially more dangerous than others. Enemies are also very easy to identify at a glance. There's no confusing pirates and cavemen. Yeah, this game does an alarmingly good job with this enemy design, and that does include visual design too. Even if they are kinda standard Halloween fare, it's still got a charm to it. Finally, there are bosses, mostly in the form of the Undead Covenant siblings. They're standard fare. Extra tanky targets who hit a bit harder than average. They don't take too much punishment, and some are invulnerable until you figure out how to damage them. Then you'll need to finish them with a scythe. These boss fights aren't worth too much discussion. They're fun, though most of them are effectively palette swaps of regular enemies with a couple new attacks. Kaissinger has a unique boss fight where you have to have an aerial magic duel with him. Cool in concept. Too bad flying is a royal pain in this game. The bosses are welcome little mix-ups, and the combat system works quite well for one-on-one combat. Speaking of bosses, we're now starting to move on to spoilers. I'm probably going to leave out a lot of details anyway, but I have to talk about this game's ending at least. Skip to this timestamp on screen if you don't want to hear it. You alright? The people who skipped will have to experience a terrible final boss for themselves. So after meeting Jeremiah and learning about the family curse, Patrick figures out he needs to go grab the Scythe of the Celts from some ancient monastery because it's the only way to kill the cursed members of the Covenant family. I don't know about you guys, but this isn't the first time I've time traveled to slay a bunch of monks and get a scythe. I always thought the time travel thing was a bit weird, but why not? It's fewer dull corridors and most dull corridors part of the game. With the scythe, the game becomes about Patrick scratching off his hit list for a good while. In the meantime, Jeremiah is beheaded by Clive Barker's character in Clive Barker's Undying, voiced by Clive Barker, named Jive Starker. Patrick also takes a detour in going to kill an old rival of his while he's in town, and by town I mean in this weird red Zen dimension. Also, I just want to quickly mention something that bothers me. The final stretch of this game is started right after you kill Aaron Covenant, who's the weird ghost guy. Patrick, this tough, fearless, gun-toting wizard, faints like a swooning woman from an old movie after being jump scared. This is used to send you to the caveman dimension, lazily enough. I always hated fainting as a way to transition the player between areas, but whatever. After killing the most powerful of the siblings, Bethany, Patrick is literally magically teleported to the island of Standing Stones. Jeremiah reveals that he's still alive since he wasn't killed with a scythe. He had been corrupted all along and wants to free a giant monster under the Standing Stones to absorb its power. Basically, a bunch of tough talk for someone in scything distance.
I'll show the world the true meaning of reality.
You know what, Jeremiah? You talk too much.
Now that the family is wiped out, there's nothing containing the giant monster anymore. Oops. This might have been Jeremiah's plan, but he still comes across as a massive idiot. Now you need to kill this weird, Kami-sama knows. I'm assuming Clive Barker specifically asked for it to have a Mouthless though. It's a really easy, boring, prolonged fight. It reminds me of Dead Space 1 in that it's basically a giant monster set piece as your reward for making it to the end of the game, rather than an actual boss fight. Upon it dying, Patrick tries to run away from the island he's currently standing on. He gets knocked out by something, I don't know, this cutscene is pretty janky. He then gets rescued by some guy who's visible for a septillionth of a picosecond much earlier in the game. He loses the grip of Tharstone and roll sequel baiting. Yeah, the rest of the ending is Patrick teasing a sequel that would never come. It's just some stuff about how there's other vaults and vault monsters out there. You kinda get the idea. The game didn't sell well enough to get a sequel, so oh well. I do like the story. My favorite part is mostly Patrick, frankly. His raised eyebrow is a consistent highlight of the cutscenes. Still, if you're a big fan of optional reading and lore in your first-person shooters, you'll probably adore Undying. You don't need to pay too much attention to it, but what's here is quality. So, what are my final thoughts on Undying? Well, I personally think it's a good 9-hour spooky romp. It's undoubtedly janky and it has aged poorly in a handful of ways. Still, it's both an exciting dual-wield gun magic game and a fun roller coaster ride. It's ambitious, fairly well put together, and there's clearly a lot of love put into it. I mean, what other game lets you fly around chopping up cavemen with a scythe? I've always wanted to do that, and thankfully, Clive Barker was here for me. I ultimately recommend it. You can't really go wrong with a Scooby-Doo haunted house roller coaster ride like this. Even if the horror aspects lighten up as the game goes along, it's adequately Halloween-y for Halloween. Merry Christmas and Happy 4th of July. See ya next time. This is an unusually short outro by my standards. I guess I just don't have too much to say. I don't know what game I'm going to be covering next. I do have a couple of things on my mind, but I don't know what I'll do. I have an email down below in the description, so if you want to send me something, I'll take a look at it. No guarantee I'll do it. Just I'll look at it. So, for real, see you next time.